special thank you to Black Diamond Therapeutics, Invax, Kintara Therapeutics, Novacure, Karyopharm Therapeutics, Prelude Therapeutics, Cortana Pharmaceuticals, Immunomic Therapeutics, Istari Oncology, Casia Therapeutics, Medicina, Moderna, Oncorus, O'Neill Comprehensive Cancer Center, the University of Alabama at Birmingham, OU Health Stevenson Cancer Center, the Colony Group, the Society for Neuro-Oncology, Stanford Healthcare, VBI Vaccines, American Association of Neurological Surgeons, and the Integra Foundation for their support of the 2021 Glioblastoma Awareness Day.
Good afternoon. I'm David Ahrens, and I'm the CEO of National Brain Tumor Society. Welcome to the third annual Glioblastoma Awareness Day, where we honor those who are living with this disease, those who have succumbed to it, and to help make the general public more aware of why it's incumbent upon all of us to work to defeat glioblastoma and describe what it will take to do so. During today's panel, we'll be talking with a group of highly thoughtful, caring, and expert individuals about the challenges presented by this disease and opportunities to make progress and improve. Glioblastoma is the most common aggressive malignant form of brain cancer. It is a disease that doesn't discriminate. There is no prevention or early detection and few treatment options. It is considered to be one of the most recalcitrant cancers with a 5-year relative survival rate of just 7%. Like other brain tumors, glioblastoma affects one's sense of self and is highly debilitating. Bottom line is that everyone should want to find a cure to glioblastoma. Today, it's an honor to introduce our esteemed panel to talk about these challenges. Moderating today's panel is Eric Lipton of the New York Times and a Pulitzer Prize winner and former caregiver. We're also joined by Dr. Suzanne Chang, Director of the Division of Neuro-Oncology at the University of California, San Francisco. She is Director of the UCSF Neuro-Oncology Gordon Murray Caregiver Program and co-director of the Sheri Sobrato Brisson Brain Cancer Survivorship Program. Dr. Ned Sharpless is the director of the National Cancer Institute, for many years a treating oncologist and clinical trial designer. We're also joined by Dr. Richard Pazdur, formerly of MD Anderson and for many years now, the director of the Food and Drug Administration's Oncology Center of Excellence. We're also joined by Adam Hayden, parent, philosopher, glioblastoma patient, advocate, and member of National Brain Tumor Society's Board of Directors. David Gellis, former caregiver and now executive producer of political programming and senior broadcast producer of The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer. I'm now honored to turn it over to our moderator, Eric Lipton. Eric, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As I think about it, if there's a single thing that defines glioblastoma for researchers, for healthcare providers, for caregivers, and of course for patients, it's the unrelenting nature of this disease. It does not compromise. It's complex and it's inflexible. And it has defied decades worth of research to defeat it. So I thought today that perhaps something that would be really meaningful to all of us is to reflect upon what are some of the key challenges that are blocking the pathways to success, and sort of pausing to identify individual challenges and trying to deconstruct them a little bit, and to acknowledge these challenges and their complexities, but to think about what are some strategies to get around these roadblocks, and to talk them through and think about what are possible pathways. So I think it's a relevant exercise for all of us, not just for the researchers, but the patients themselves who are facing inexplicable challenges, and caregivers that also are facing challenges that we don't know how to really answer, but we have to because we have no other choice. So I come at this as a member of a family that has lost a loved one to glioblastoma. My older sister, Michelle, who died 8 years ago. And we're a family that struggled with some of these same questions that had no real answers. And why is this disease so hard to conquer? why, despite so much effort by so many researchers and so much funding, that there has not been significant progress. And there has not been a great deal of change in survival times. But there's a lot of things in life that are hard, and I don't think that it means that any of us gives up. We just keep looking for ways to defeat these challenges, and there's always a reason for optimism, especially with so much happening in science and genetics that I think open up potential new pathways. So essentially, we're going to ask the same questions to each of our people that are here with us today. And let's start off with Dr. Susan Chang, who not only has these hugely important titles at University of California, San Francisco, but has been involved in at least 20 active clinical trials to evaluate a spectrum of treatments from chemotherapy to immunotherapy, and so many different potential ways to attempt to combat this disease. So I want to ask the question I'm going to ask of each of the folks joining us today is, like, what is one of the most complex challenges that you have faced in your career in trying to confront glioblastoma? What would be an example of one particular challenge that you've just come up against? And let's start by just defining it and explaining that challenge to people today.
Well, thank you so much. I'd like to thank David Ahrens and the NBTS for coordinating this event to raise the awareness of challenges and the work that we need to care for our glioblastoma patients and their families. And thank you, Eric, for leading the session. So as I reflect back on that question, Eric, I think in the last decade, we have seen tremendous advances in neuroscience and neuro-oncology, primarily focused on an improved knowledge base of the molecular and cytogenetic underpinnings of glioblastoma that drive tumor growth. And in the clinic, as we care for our patients, we've always been acutely aware of the heterogeneity of response to treatment and overall outcome. And now we have a better understanding of factors beyond age and functional status. So this means that we can better counsel our patients and use this information to better design clinical trials. It gets us closer to precision medicine approach, where we can tailor treatments for the appropriate patient at the appropriate time. But countering these advances over the last decade are the unfortunate lack of clinical trials that have demonstrated a survival benefit, as you pointed out. And this really highlights the urgency to find better treatments. The impressive results of immunotherapy in other cancers have really sparked a major effort in neuro-oncology. However, to date, these approaches have not benefited our patients. And I reflect back on my early career in neuro-oncology, where the sort of default approach was to test successful chemotherapy treatments for other solid cancers and apply them to glioblastoma. But the general lack of success of that approach, we now recognize, was probably because there were so many major challenges specific to the treatment of brain tumors that span tumor heterogeneity, development of drug resistance, interactions with seizure medications that may affect the metabolism of drugs, and most importantly, addressing the challenge of the blood-brain barrier that affects the delivery of agents at high enough concentrations to reach the tumor and to have an effect. And so I wonder if expecting immunotherapy to work in glioblastoma because it worked in other cancers reflects that we haven't really changed our approach commensurate with what is really needed, which is the difficult investment in gaining knowledge of the biology of the tumor microenvironment, how the immune system is activated in the central nervous system, as well as the immunosuppressive effects of the tumor, which all have to be countered. And the lack of model systems to recapitulate the human condition is a major barrier, but it is encouraging that scientists are working creatively to assess the preclinical effect of different approaches that demonstrate a clear signal of activity before translating it to the patient. I think we're definitely on the road to discovery, leveraging what is learned from other cancers. And it's exciting that so many studies are targeting diverse aspects of the immune system, working not only on how to activate signals, but also to inhibit the brakes that limit the immune response specific to glioblastoma. And the advent of living therapeutics with genetically engineered cells is an exciting area. The challenge, though, would be how do we understand cell trafficking in the brain and the potential for adverse inflammatory effects? This will have to be addressed. But collaboration and sharing of information to leverage big data across disciplines is key to overcoming many of these challenges. So I look back on the question you asked and focusing on key translational questions such as what is the target? Is it hit and modulated? And does this translate to improved efficacy? And this applies to the evaluation of novel targeted therapies as well as immunotherapy. But it's exciting that in addition to novel trial designs that incorporate a biological endpoint, there are many exciting delivery platforms that encompass nanotechnology, as well as viral therapies and blood-brain barrier disruption efforts that are being explored. And I think the new NCI investment to support collaboration among institutions in the glioblastoma therapeutics network will focus specifically on the early evaluation of novel treatments. So hopefully we have more robust signals to point the way to success. So as we explore new treatments, which is really probably the biggest challenge that we have, a patient-centered approach is critical, not only to enhance accrual to therapeutic studies to assess side effects and effectiveness, but also to build key partnerships to conduct important correlative studies, such as imaging biomarkers, liquid biopsies, and tissue acquisition for translational studies. I think more emphasis also has to be made on interventions to preserve and enhance the quality of life and the functional aspects of the patient. So while working tirelessly on the development of new treatment strategies, we also have to keep in mind that the patient and their caregivers need support here and now. The NCI definition of cancer survivor spans the time of diagnosis through the entire life of that patient. And this definition appropriately highlights the importance of key aspects of the patient's journey that address the physical, the psychosocial effects of the disease and treatment, the health promotion, chronic conditions, and recurrence. And a priority has to be placed on shared decision-making and ways to enhance the wellness and quality of life of patients. And this needs really a collaborative, multidimensional approach, focusing on emotional and physical and cognitive health. We also know that caregivers of neuro-oncology patients face many challenges. They want to be recognized as an integral part of the care team, and they report many types of unmet needs that are different from the patient because of the disease can have unique caregiving situations. So not only are they dealing with as a life-limiting and serious illness, they may have to also manage seizures and mobility issues, alteration in personality and communication challenges, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral changes. And they experience different levels of distress at different phases of the illness. So supporting the caregiver is critical to enhancing the care of the patient and should be a priority and commitment for all of us. And the major goal should be to normalize the experience of caring for the caregiver, to be intentional to anticipate the needs and proactively provide support. So moving forward as a field, as I reflect on your question, Eric, I am really encouraged as we continue to foster partnerships across many groups to integrate novel lab discoveries, advanced molecular characterization, cutting-edge technology, state-of-the-art treatments and clinical trial options, while supporting the patient and caregiver, all with the goal to deliver precision care. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We're now going to go on to Dr. Sharpless, who, as director of the National Cancer Institute, knows so well that dramatic progress can be made. I mean, look at cervical cancer and the progress that's been made with cervical cancer. And the Biden administration, now has created the Advanced Research Projects Agency, a kind of a DARPA-like thing that National Cancer Institute is going to be doing. So it's setting up a kind of a standard for more aggressive and innovative research. So I wanted to ask as well, what would you identify as, the single biggest roadblock that you have encountered? I mean, there are many roadblocks, but how would you identify that roadblock, and what has made it so hard to get around, and what are some potential ways to circumvent it from your perspective?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, what we're really missing in order to have better outcomes in glioblastoma, what we're really missing is the biologic understanding of the cancer to allow for screening, prevention, better diagnosis, treatment, though, whatever avenue you think is going to reduce mortality from glioma. The basic science just isn't really there yet. And so we need more insight into the disease and how it works. And that is somewhat frustrating thing because it's hard to predict. You never know when you're going to you don't know when you're going to know what you don't know, right? So the next discovery that's really going to break things open is it's never quite clear when that's going to happen. And that is challenging to explain to people because obviously, everyone wants to see progress in a disease like glioma as quickly as possible. I think what you can say is that in general, we're having good news in cancer. We're seeing a lot of progress in a variety of cancers. We just had the annual report of the nation come out, which is the annual sort of compilation of incidence and mortality statistics around cancer. We've seen steady declines in cancer mortality in the United States since the 1990s, in particular acceleration of those declines in the last few years because of better diagnosis, treatment, and survivorship. And we've seen remarkable improvements in some other kinds of cancer that have been very, very refractory, like, lung cancer, melanoma. When I was a fellow starting out in this business, those were about the two worst cancers imaginable. And now we're seeing, year over year declines of 5% or more in mortality of those diseases because of a lot of reasons. So I think that when that scientific understanding coalesces and when you have the ability to make progress against the disease, that progress can be quite rapid and really great. But we just haven't had that yet in glioblastoma. And that doesn't mean we're not trying. We have intense focus on glioma and would like to see more progress in the disease and are adopting a variety of approaches toward that end.
It's interesting because both you and Dr. Chang are sort of similar, seem to be saying somewhat similar of a thing, which is that the approach has generally been to throw, treatments that have perhaps been promising to other cancers at glioblastoma, even though your point, Dr. Sharpless, is that we still don't fundamentally understand how this cancer works. And so it does seem, how do you target funding more towards the basic understanding of how this type of cancer operates so that you can more effectively develop treatments? How do you push the researchers in that direction? Right. Well,
I think there are, we tried the approach of just trying stuff that works in other diseases in glioma, and that hasn't been terribly successful for lots of reasons that I think Dr. Chang mentioned. It's just kind of a different kind of cancer. It has this blood-brain barrier that makes the drugs not get in. You can't resect the tumor very easily because it's in a place that's anatomically difficult. It's hard to do lots of clinical trials for a variety of reasons. There isn't really a prevention and screening approach the way there is, say, for colon cancer, breast cancer, for glioma. And so, it provides a bunch of challenges that make it quite different from other cancers. But so what I would argue you need is really that sort of wiring diagram, that molecular understanding, the machinery that would allow you to identify the therapeutic vulnerabilities and then come up with effective treatments that get around all of those kinds of problems. And so, how does the NCI do that? We have sort of two approaches that I think are most relevant here. One is we provide resources to clever basic scientists and translational researchers. So we allow the investigators to, have investigator-initiated research to come up with ideas that they think would be useful in a disease like glioblastoma. And so we can target funding for an area like glioblastoma and have done that. And we do that both through the sort of traditional classic basic science grant, like an R01 type grant, or we also have, these sort of center grants, these SPOREs, these program excellence grants that, of which there have been a few glioma proposals in that area. We have targeted areas, so we decided we needed more single cell sequencing of glioma and came up with these Project CARE and Project HOPE through supplement mechanisms to support that. So, there's the provision of resources for interesting research questions in glioblastoma is kind of approach one. Approach two is really by collaborating with partners, the relevant partners in this area. And so that might be other parts of the NIH, like NINDS, the Neurosciences Institute that is very interested in glioma as well. That might be partnering with other parts of government, like the FDA, which has a long-standing interest in progress in glioma and interesting interactions with the NCI in that regard. That might be partnering with advocacy and patient groups and that we support. And lastly, that might be partnering with industry, which is, I think, would like to see more advances in glioma as well. So, the NCI has this sort of ability to convene partnerships and help work with multiple stakeholders to advance progress. So it's providing resources for the important research questions and then making sure that the best ideas can all kind of come together through a collaborative research to make progress for our patients.
Great. Okay, well, that's really interesting, and let's hope that you continue to make progress on these things. I'm going to switch now to Dr. Pazdur, who is the director of the Oncology Center for Excellence at the FDA and has been in that role for incredible 20 years of effort. And I mean, I've read recently just about the progress that has been made in terms of turning around drugs faster, getting them approved faster, which is clearly an important thing. And so, wanted to ask you, from your perspective, what what would you identify? How would you define with the single biggest or a single major obstacle that you have faced in answering this challenge relative to glioblastoma?
I think this has already been described by both of the previous speakers. I think the major issue is really understanding the disease, the targets, the basic science. It is not a matter or problem of drug regulation. To have a drug regulation of a drug, one has to show and have a belief that it works and is a benefit to patients. And nobody wants false hope, obviously, just to approve a drug that doesn't work or is so marginal that one can't really even assess it or based on anecdotal information. I think one of the other aspects that we should consider is really understanding the disease more. This probably is not just one disease. It may have various subtypes of the disease that are better defined on a molecular basis and will give us clues into how to treat the disease. I'd like to go back to something that Ned Sharpless talked about is other recalcitrant tumors that we've seen progress in. When I first began my career in lung cancer and almost 30, 40 years ago, there were only two types of cancer, lung cancer, small cell lung cancer and non-small cell lung cancer. Well, we've defined on a molecular basis non-small cell lung cancer and have multiple subtypes of this disease with very targeted therapies, with patients reaching a great deal of benefit with really modest to very mild toxicity with some of these therapies. So I think one is really understanding the disease and not just saying it's GBM and let's just call everything GBM, so to speak, but really trying to understand the basic disease itself, targets that may be appropriate to some populations that may not be evident in other patients. That being said, this is a difficult disease. I think, as I mentioned before, I'd like to see more basic research in this disease because I think that this holds the really promise to developing effective therapies. Once we understand the basic disease and targets, the development of drugs is relatively straightforward. One could take a look at response rate, tumor shrinkage. One could take a look at survival studies. One could take a look at time to progression. Many of these trials have pluses and minuses associated with that, but they become relatively straightforward when we're really talking about very effective therapies because efficacy trumps everything. And when you see a big effect, it's evident to patients, it's evident to the drug regulators, it's evident to clinicians, it's evident to the general medical community. And again, we've seen this in other diseases that have had few therapies associated with it and now have had tremendous success in their therapeutic armamentarium that's available to patients. So again, we need a better understanding of this disease. We need a better understanding of targets. We need another better understanding of how immunology may play a role in the treatment of this disease. Over my career, I've really noticed really kind of three classes of drugs that have come up. One has been the conventional cytotoxic drugs, which we've been for 40 years experimenting with, and with plus minus failures, some success in some diseases. But the development of these drugs have been pretty much trying to find the needle in the haystack. Then around the beginning of this millennium in the year 2001 or 2002, with the advent of imatinib for CML, it became evident that we could take a more targeted approach rather than this needle in the haystack philosophy of drug development. And that has helped develop and usher in a large number of drugs in multiple diseases aimed at specific molecular targets. But here again, there has to be a marriage of a basic understanding of the disease, redefining the disease into molecular subtypes, and then marrying a drug to that target. The other big advance is the advent of the checkpoint inhibitors and immunotherapy in general. And unfortunately, the area of glioblastoma multiforme has not benefited from this class of drugs. I think we shouldn't close the door on this, and I think that other newer immunological maneuvers, in quotations, may hold promise to these patients, because here again, this class of drugs have revolutionized almost every tumor type in a period of 5 to 6 years. We in oncology have had almost 67, almost 70 indications for new indications for treatment of malignant disease with the PD-1, PD-L1 drug class. So I just like to reiterate that we as the FDA regulate primary industry, and I think we have to really stimulate industry to really step up its game in developing drugs for this disease. Many times it's a small disease, but that doesn't mean that industry would not be interested because it doesn't have a huge patient number such as lung cancer or such as breast cancer. But when one really does have an effective therapy, industry is very interested in developing a drug in that disease. So I think that the drug regulation will follow after we have effective therapies, and the regulatory hurdles to getting a drug approved will be minimal, really, if these drugs are truly effective.
I just wonder, I mean, as a caregiver, and brother of someone that was suffering from this disease, and having then flipped through all of the different options for clinical trials, it really just did seem as if so many of the researchers were just, throwing different drug combinations. And I just wonder, between, Dr. Pazdur and Dr. Sharpless, I mean, there just seems that there needs to be a way to really, to try to force the basic understanding of the disease, because as you're both saying, only then can you, and more quickly, develop the treatment for it. And I guess I just wonder, what role can the government play in really trying to drive first an understanding? I mean, it means a delay because you aren't presenting the potential solution immediately. But Dr. Pazdur, what can you do to really drive, to incentivize the research to first understand the disease itself?
Well, that's hard for the FDA to do because we don't regulate basic research or give funding to research. So I think that that's more of an area that Dr. Sharpless could address, but in the discussion session. But I think that is really where the important point is. There is a short-term need that is an immediate need for patients that have the disease, and I think that's why you are seeing these clinical trials to see, are the drugs that we have available now going to be of some benefit to patients, okay? And that is a reasonable avenue of research. What I'm talking about is kind of a transformational step of really understanding the disease, understanding the drugs, and that's a much more long-term approach to the treatment of the disease. And both of these should happen. They are not mutually exclusive, because here again, we do have patients with this disease that are looking for help, and we should not really not hear their cries for help here also. Right.
Okay, well, thank you, and we'll come back with some questions after we get through the additional two participants here. So, Adam, we met last year virtually again, or maybe 2 years ago now. It's a bit of a blur, having gone through the pandemic, and wanted to get your sense as someone that is living through this really challenging experience. What for you is, I mean, how do you define, I mean, there's so many things that are hard about this. What from your perspective is the thing that has been the biggest hurdle, if such a thing exists?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, and thanks for being a part of this panel. Man, it's a terrific awareness opportunity for all of us in the community. I think what I want to remark on is I want to give sort of the patient side of what the other panelists have just spoken to, and I want to start with some of the words that we've heard. We've heard that this disease is unrelenting, is recalcitrant, is defiant. And what I want to highlight is that just as the disease is indeed that way, so also are us patient advocates, that we are unrelenting and we are defiant and that we are recalcitrant. So the advocates, this community that I'm fortunate enough to represent today, they carry that same energy. In fact, National Brain Tumor Society, our mission we state that we unrelentingly invest in, mobilize, and unite the brain tumor community. So I'm honored to be among that member of advocates. You know, I am struck that Doctors Chang and Sharpless and Pazdur have reflected on kind of some of the basic biology requirements. So how does that live out in a patient's experience? So I am beyond my 5-year mark of living with this recalcitrant disease, a glioblastoma. And I am asked all the time by newly diagnosed folks, well, Adam, what is your secret? And the reality is much of my secret, in fact, is no secret at all. It is just kind of the dumb biological luck that I harbor certain molecular or genetic characteristics that makes my type of glioblastoma or my type of glioma more responsive to some of our therapies. So as we ask our bench researchers to produce a more basic biology to understand the mechanisms of the disease, with that knowledge, we can better inform the quality of life for patients like me, so that we don't feel as though, gosh, my survival was much more abbreviated than someone else's survival. That we know that that isn't the fault of the patient, but basic biology can help us understand that that is sort of the biological underpinning. So I think that call to basic biology is not only to expedite treatments and ultimately deliver on a cure, but it also helps to explain why I'm out here living for 5 years. And tragically, I have lost many of my peers along the way. And I think that dovetails nicely into this broader point, getting to some of the challenges, this broader point about survivorship. So I think it was Dr. Chang who defined for us earlier, survivorship really is the kind of the point of diagnosis through the entire lifespan of a patient like me. So survivorship in glioblastoma is a bit grim. You heard David at the top of this discussion highlight the relative survival rate is about 7%. So I'm among that really marginal percentage of folks living with this disease. I will be completely candid at this point. My wife, Whitney, my caregiver, or we like to say care partner in the brain tumor space, because we are partners in care together. You know, she said quite candidly at our 4-year mark, I'm 5 years now, but at 4 years, Whitney said, gosh, Adam, this is terrific, but how will we live another 4 years like this? So I do have motor impairments on one side of my body. I suffer with persistent focal seizures. So managing the complexity of this disease, it's not only about cytotoxic or toxic cancer therapies and all of that. It's also about the real neurological impairments of this disease. I suffer with short-term memory loss. And the truth is, I'm really in a strong functional health compared to many folks who are at 5 years plus of glioblastoma survivorship. So I think it's important to highlight, I look good and I sound pretty good, or at least I hope you think so, but I am not necessarily representative of the entire population. I'm proud to be a representative, but I want to highlight the struggles are very, very real. We've got 3 young kids at home. They these days are 9, 7, and 5 years old. Our youngest was only 8 months old at my time of diagnosis. We just didn't know if I would, so our 8-month-old then will go to kindergarten in just a few weeks here. We had no idea if dad would be around to see our youngest make it to kindergarten. So living with that burden day in and day out, living with the financial toxicity of this disease. It is an expensive illness. I mean, this is, thank goodness that we've got healthcare access and we've got health, medical coverage, medical benefits, et cetera. But, you know, this can be $100,000, $120,000, $150,000 on average. Now, insurance, of course, helps to absorb some of those costs for a family like mine, but there's still significant out-of-pocket expenses. Of course, I do work part-time, but I was an upwardly mobile, full-time career person at the time of diagnosis. As a young man, I was diagnosed at 34 years old. So not only do you have out-of-pocket expenses, but also my productivity in the working world is significantly diminished. I don't drive because of seizures, for example. Fatigue makes it such that after about 4 hours in front of a screen, I really need a lot of recovery time. So when I think about the challenges, I think the other panelists have highlighted those challenges at the basic mechanical level, at the precision medicine, at increasing to learn more about the genomics of this disease. And of course, that is happening more and more all the time, and we applaud that in the patient community. But as we hope and see more survivors, then we wonder, what will the roadmap look like? So folks like me, I just don't really know. I see into the fog into my future. I hope that I keep going, and I intend to, but I know that there's not a tremendous amount of certainty for me as to what the next week, month, a year or more will look like as my disease progresses. So it's about survivorship that I would highlight as one of the major challenges. Thanks.
Right. Yeah, no, thank you. And my sister, lived for 8 years, which is an incredible, amount of time, and watched her kids grow up and her first child go on to college. And, it makes you think just about how every day in our lives is truly a blessing. And, watching your children grow up is, it's terrible, but it's also incredible to be doing that for 5 years. And, I guess I just, before I turn to David, is there one thing that you can think back on, that 5 years in that, that kind of a challenge that you now recognize was that, for someone that's first entering this whole life defining experience, is there any, there's so many things, but again, is there any single thing that you look back on and you have a different perspective on that you realize now, or that you gradually came to realize that this was a challenge that you think differently about now? Is there any one thing that occurs to you?
Yeah, one of the things, so I've kept an active personal blog throughout this process. And one of the early things that I declared was that I am not going to be a cancer mascot. That didn't feel like the right fit for me. I said, I'm still a guy in the world that has plans and things that I want to do, and I don't want to be defined by this disease. But as I continued to live with this illness, to connect with others in the patient community, to be an advocate, to meet with folks like Dr. Pazdur, like Dr. Sharpless, and other folks in government to express our needs, I realized that it is not a stain to be a cancer mascot, but it is an honor. And so I think that's how my kind of evolution thinking about this has shifted. There's a podcast, the Sick Boy podcast by a guy named Jeremy Saunders. I saw him give a talk at Endwell where he said, you know what, I will be defined by my disease, but I'm going to do it on my terms with my illness. And I think that's my evolving understanding, is that I've embraced that being, I am part of this brain cancer universe. I don't want to deny that. I don't want to be afraid or ashamed of that. I want to embrace that. And so to define the illness on my terms as I navigate the future, I think that's been an evolution in my thinking.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that's important. And we've all benefited from you being active and outspoken on it. So thank you for your willingness to do that. And it does not define you. I think generally, people just appreciate your the audacity that it takes to be so energetic, and not kind of crawling into a hole. But obviously that's the right approach in terms of quality of life as well. So let's go on to David, who, had an incredibly difficult 2020. His father had already been diagnosed with glioblastoma, and then really terribly, his mom then unexpectedly died. His mom, who was an artist and a photographer and filmmaker, and in March of 2020, and then his father did die then in July of 2020, just not very many months later, from glioblastoma, and his father, who was a very prominent sociologist. So he's was a partner or a caregiver, for someone, and having to be a caregiver at the same time as he suffered an incredible loss. So, wanted to ask David about, the thing that really stands out to you, the challenge that is the most complex and hard to come to terms with. How would you define that, David?
Well, I think one of the challenges, thank you, Eric, just sitting on this panel and listening to where we are, it's still incredibly frustrating to me to hear that, we haven't quite made progress in terms of where patients and caregivers like myself and my mother could have benefited. One, as you mentioned, my father was diagnosed in June of 2019. And while we were having this discussion, I was looking at my phone. I remember I had a picture of what his tumor looked like. And I just feel like sometimes I'm a visual guy, I work in television. So I feel like I did a lot of documenting of the journey. But my father was diagnosed in June of 2019. I remember the call from my mother telling me, that they were in the emergency room in Philadelphia, and she said, they found a mass on your father's brain. And obviously, I immediately, just a few hours later, was on an Amtrak train to Philadelphia and in the emergency room talking to the neurosurgeon who wanted to perform surgery the next morning. And I lost my father to this disease, but I also say that I lost my mother because the shock and trauma of trying to care for my father and the loss of hope that was there, I think, is one of the reasons why my mother, unfortunately, I think, died of a ruptured brain aneurysm on March 14th, 2020. Looking back, I think the thing that's so difficult was, I just want to talk about my mother's experience for a moment, was, there was just so much shock of getting a cancer diagnosis like this and not a lot of options of what to do. The idea of going in for brain surgery within moments of the diagnosis isn't something that happens for most cancer patients, as we know. Lots of other cancers, what happens is you get the diagnosis and you have time to think it over. It was just a simple matter of hours before we decided we needed to do this emergency surgery, because the alternative, the doctor said, was maybe my father would have a month to live. Obviously, you want to do anything you can to extend life. I think the unfortunate thing in my journey was we did not lack in resources in terms of trying to find the right clinical trial or the right immunotherapy. But I remember early on talking to the folks at NIH and the National Cancer Institute to figure out what could I do for my father. And unfortunately, the answer was nothing. And still, when we went and met with my father's oncologist, his radiation oncologist, with his surgeon, they all tried to give us hope. But as the journey went on, and it really wasn't that long, from June of 2019 to June of 2020, the options really ran out. Sadly, in my story, my mother died the same day that really the options ran out for any hope for my father. He had gone in that morning for gamma knife radiation at Pennsylvania Hospital, and they did a scan and they saw that the cancer really had just spread everywhere, and they gave him at that point about 6 months to live. And my mother that night was back in the same hospital with the same exact neurologist who had treated my father that day with a ruptured brain aneurysm, and died. And really, I say, what's so sad as a caregiver for her was that there was no more hope. When she ran out of hope, that there were no more options, all of the experimental things that we've talked about at the top of this panel discussion today, none of them worked. And that really was detrimental, I think, in some ways, to my mother's ability to care for my father. The thing is, all of a sudden, in this dramatic, unfortunate way, I then became the caregiver for my father. I made the decision when there were no more options that we should begin hospice care in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic, and to do anything I could to just extend my father's life in the easiest way possible. The interesting thing, though, that I will say just about making that decision, once we transitioned to hospice care, all of a sudden there were more options for me as a caregiver than there were for my mother when she was trying to figure out how to deal with my father. Because, as you know, with hospice care, and it's all covered by Medicare, I immediately had a social worker who was dedicated to me. There were psychologists and who would help me with grief and prepare for grief, even though I was grieving for my mother. There were more resources available once we knew he absolutely was going to die, as opposed to the resources that were available from the moment that he was diagnosed. So my message in just trying to, as someone that became the second caregiver in my father's life and was with him until that moment of death, is that we need to find better ways to find hope. It's unfortunate, I think, that for anyone that would be watching this panel discussion today and looking like I was in June of 2019, thinking, what is it? What can I do? What is the special treatment that I can find for my father to extend his life? That there aren't a lot of good options. And the fact that we aren't providing enough hope for this disease still continues to haunt me to this day.
Yeah, I think, your experience was similar to mine as a brother of a then patient. And you're thrown into it, and you think that somehow if you do lots of research and talk to lots of oncologists and you find out what their various, research studies are and various experimental drugs that maybe you could find a solution, but ultimately you come to realize that there really isn't one. But you go through this process as an individual caregiver or partner of someone. And I do agree that there's very little upfront. You're kind of out on your own because you've got it. And it can drive you as a partner or caregiver crazy because you're so desperate to find a solution. But there's very little guidance provided because you're basically interviewing these different oncologists and who have different formulas that they may offer you. And that is a really hard thing. I think it's true. And until you come to the place where you realize that the best quality of life that you can have for your partner or your father, mother, sibling, whatever, spouse, that's probably and extend life as much as possible. But I agree with that entry point is for the caregiver, I think, is one of the hardest things. And there aren't really, the internet can become a scary place also, as well, as I'm sure you learned, right? It's a hard period. So there doesn't seem to be as much focus, David. Is it true? Do you think in terms of organizations to help people who have just suddenly walked into that to help them understand that challenge? I mean,
absolutely. I think one of the hardest things, especially with just the aggressiveness of this disease and the fact that unlike so many other cancers, there are not a lot of good options for treatment. And given the fact that the survival rate is so difficult, trying to get caregivers, family members, and the patients themselves to wrap their head around it. Unfortunately, in my father's case, a very bright guy and a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, by the time he came out of that surgery, he was not the same person ever again. And there was no more, he would have been the perfect guy. I was embracing all of the things that he would have done as an academic researcher of trying to find, the best possible solution to extend his life. For my mother, she ended up deciding that the best thing she could do was a macrobiotic diet. And, I watched this poor man eating, kale and kimchi for breakfast. And, a guy who loved donuts and loved Oreo cookies. And it just didn't seem like, to me, the best way to finish out, his final year of life, given, the prognosis. And I feel like, if I could go back, would I let him eat more Oreo cookies? I mean, maybe. I also wonder if, knowing what I know now and having seen what it did, like, it was more important to be able to have, just a better quality of life than suffering through radiation and chemo that really proved sort of inefficient, ineffective, and kind of, hurt his final months of living. Trying to talk through that with anyone who is, diagnosed today or in the future, trying to understand that, I think is critically important. I'm hopeful, as I think all of us are, that something will change in that. But trying to get our heads around how difficult that is to know that you've got a limited amount of time and how to manage that. Incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that there's a certain incentive for oncologists to try to offer patients potential answers, and so that you encounter more thoughts about potential answers than you do kind of straight talk about, quality of life and the importance of quality of life when you first are entering this whole phase. And that's something that perhaps the oncologist should be thinking more about, is the need to just be blunt. And while there are a lot of clinical trials, that the likelihood of any single clinical trial really panning out is pretty low. I don't know if your father had enough time or kind of, in health capacity to do any of the clinical trials, but because he did not live as long as my sister did, but that was a challenge as well. So maybe we go on to some general questions, which we'll just kind of ask some questions. I mean, I guess, going back to something that the physicians here each spoke about, so what can be done to motivate the biopharmas to do the research and clinical trials that really matter. And, it's not just in terms of, what can be done to really incentivize understanding the disease. And maybe I asked that of Dr. Sharpless.
Yeah, I think there, it's, it would be, you asked me to be blunt. it would be easier to say, this is a simple problem and I know how we're going to fix it. We have a 3-point plan. And there are research questions the NCI faces that are like that are sort of known unknowns, that if I provide this many grants for that problem for this many years, we'll have a solution. And there's certain clinical trials questions where I can guarantee you that approach will work. That is not what we're dealing with in glioblastoma, in my opinion. I mean, this disease, we just need, it's not like we can't get the grants out the door quickly enough, or we don't have enough, we just need some new ideas. We need a new, better understanding of the disease. I think a very important point is that we really need to embrace and appreciate the heterogeneity of this disease and stop treating it like one cancer and everybody gets the same cookie cutter approach. And that clearly doesn't work. And so we have to figure out what's different between, David's dad and Adam. Why is Adam alive and looks great, by the way? Good to see you again. 5 years later, and other patients really don't respond at all and blow right through therapy and die quickly. And that is, I think, a marker of the heterogeneity of this disease. That sometimes our therapies work and sometimes they fail miserably, and we don't really understand why. And if we've understood that, I think that's the beginning to progress, right? Then we could start to say, you have the kind of cancer that's going to benefit, and therefore you should go through all this, and you have the kind of cancer that isn't, and maybe early hospice is the right way to go for you. And then we can focus on those patients and try and find new therapies for them. So that's the way it works. I mean, we need to just invest in the basic science, and the process takes a long time, but it does eventually work. We're starting to see some cancers now where we have, where we never had survivorship was an issue. We just didn't have that problem, like, some forms of head and neck cancer. Now we're seeing long-term survivors, and we're worried about all these new problems that our therapy causes that we didn't even know about a few years ago. So maybe the last point to make about this is that it doesn't look like progress at all until progress arrives. So, my father died of metastatic melanoma in 2010. The first immunotherapy drug for metastatic melanoma was approved in 2011. I can promise you in 2010, things looked pretty bleak for metastatic melanoma, and that we had 30 years of progress and lots of new therapies and lots of ideas, but it didn't really pay off until about 12 months after my dad died. So, and now we cure big C, make the cancer go away, never come back. Most patients with metastatic melanoma now, just a mere less than 10 years later. So when the progress happens, it can happen pretty quickly. It doesn't look like much is happening from the outside until we finally get there, but we can get there pretty quickly. And so I have hope that some of these new ideas, the NCI is funding, that through these networks and trials and spores and whatnot that I mentioned, will turn into that kind of progress for this disease. And I think this appreciation of these subtypes and heterogeneity is the beginning of what that looks like.
Dr. Chang, I just wanted to ask you, as a researcher that is often seeking support for the research that you're doing, how do you think that you can incentivize the kind of the work that needs to be done to fully understand the disease? What do you think is a choice to accomplish that?
Well, thank you. I think you've heard very elegantly from everyone about the importance of understanding truly the biology that would drive the reason to invest in a therapy that makes sense. I think that's really critical. I think too, keeping in mind the patient. So you've heard about how difficult this is for the patients, and keeping in mind the toxicities and the side effects that patients can undergo, and making this a true partnership with them in terms of, engaging patients to understand why we're doing the studies, the benefit of participating in trials that span not only therapeutics, but also quality of life. These are things that I think we just need to bring to the forefront, in addition to driving the discoveries for new treatments.
And Adam, I guess I wonder, how do you feel about the idea that maybe there needs to be more work on basic research and less, potential new drugs? I mean, that as Dr. Pazdur was saying, to some extent, that might mean that there are, fewer drugs that are coming into clinical research. But then the argument is, well, you really need to understand the science before you can find the solution. So Adam, how do you feel as someone that's struggling with disease, thinking that, well, maybe they need to focus more money and effort on understanding the basic science, which might mean a pause in some of the additional clinical trials? What do you think about that idea, Adam?
Yeah, so I think that there can be a helpful feedback loop that we develop between those who set the research agenda and then patient advocates sort of on the ground. And I think patient advocates can share their experiences that can inform the research direction, whether that is research priorities or even taking a hard look at what the clinical endpoints may be that we use to approve drugs. When you have such grim survivorship, such a dismal prognosis, maybe overall survival is not the best metric to approve drugs. That's outside of my wheelhouse, so I'll back away from that. But I do think that patients are altruistic, and that I go to the Hill every year with hundreds of brain tumor advocates, and we know that it takes a while to get drugs to market. And we know that many of us who are asking for increased medical research funding, we may not necessarily benefit individually from the research that we are calling on to fund, and yet we go anyway. So I think, patients are happy to pitch in where the researchers tell us that they need the support. If they're going to listen to us and partner with us so that our priorities are heard, and that for clinical trial design and stuff, we can get involved in accruing the right number to make that a statistically significant trial, et cetera, we're here to be partners. And if researchers say, listen, basic biology is what's needed now, then advocates are going to sign up and say, well, then let's get it done. How much money do you need? Okay, well, I think we're going to cut back to David Ahrens, and I'm sorry that we wasn't able to circle around everyone for this second round here, but David, you had some thoughts?
Sure. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful, really a candid and caring discussion of the realities of glioblastoma and the really a diversity of perspectives about how to take on this disease. We couldn't agree more. We have to tackle the basic biological challenges, but at the same time, we need to take those shots on goal, so to speak. We do know that while quite a few major clinical trials did not hit their final objective or their primary endpoint over the last decade, there were patients that did respond to some of these drugs, and we need to learn why. And so we need to be able to sort of walk and chew gum, answer those, learn more about the disease, but at the same time, make some attempts to prosecute, to evaluate the drugs that are coming up, and the devices and the drug device combinations, for that matter, that are coming up in the pipeline. We do need to make sure that patients know that organizations like ours and so many others can be and are available as a home base for education, support, peer-to-peer. That you don't have to go alone in this disease unless you want to, but we hope you don't, that groups like National Brain Tumor Society and other support groups are here for you. We need to keep working with the FDA to improve and develop better and better clinical trials so that as those great discoverers coming through the NCI have brilliant ideas, they can be translated even more rapidly. And as Dr. Chang said, we can improve that handoff between medical academic science and where industry picks up and develops more advanced clinical trials, and to do that more rapidly. But one thing's for sure, is it's going to take all of us that have been on this call, all the agencies, all the patients working together with the researchers, with all of us as stakeholders together. We know that, like Dr. Sharpless said, we're going to see breakthroughs when we see them, but together we can create a more favorable likelihood of seeing those successes happen, hopefully more rapidly, by working together and collaborating just as we did today. And so really appreciate all of your time today, all of you on this panel, and all that you're doing, and that of your teams and labs and staffs to be so dedicated to the brain tumor community.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us, and hopefully this was folks learned some things and realize that this is a worthwhile endeavor. That's a long-term one, but is someday is going to pay off in a big way. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.